Hi guys, today we're going to talk about two terms that probably you already heard of. If you're a startup founder, you most likely did, and they are strictly correlated with each other, and the two terms are burn rate and runway. So what is the burn rate? The burn rate is a term used by venture-backed or angel-backed companies to refer to the amount of negative cash flows that they are generating on a monthly basis. The burn rate is always referred to as month, right? There are two important distinction in between the burn rates: gross burn rate and net burn rate. And now I'm going to tell you what they are. When it comes to the gross burn rate, we're talking about the total amount of negative cash flows that your company is generating, right? So most likely refers to the all cost base that you have, or more specifically to the cash that you are spending on a monthly basis. The net one, on the other hand, refers to the gross burn rate, so the total costs minus the net positive cash flow that your company is generating. So if you are not pre-revenues, you probably have some revenues coming in or some cash, and as a consequence, the net is that the total cost minus the total negative cash flows minus the total positive cash flows, and that's your net. Simple. So why do we talk about burn rate and cash flow as opposed to revenues and costs, even though these two terms are quite correlated? The reason is quite simple. So if you start business, you know that as soon as you start any accounting course, they're going to tell you that profit is an opinion and cash is the king. And why is that? Because the way you report your revenues and costs on the books, in your accounting, may differ from the moment when those revenues, those costs actually take the form of cash. So when either you pay out or you get paid, right? If you're issuing an invoice today, right, in September, for instance, but it gets paid in October, on your books, it looks like you made revenues this month, but truth is that revenue is going to convert into a positive entry in your bank account the next. So why does the difference matter so much? It's quite intuitive, right? You want to keep track of how much you're burning in terms of cash as opposed to how much you are generating on the books. Quite intuitive. Let's make an example. So let's say that you're generating revenues for let's say 100,000 euro on a monthly basis, but only 70 of that is paid during the same month, right? At the same time, you have cost for 120,000 euro, right? On a book level, it looks like your negative margin for the month is 20,000 euro. If we look at the cash, let's assume that the costs are all paid during the same month. So the cash says that you generated 70,000 euro in positive and had an outflow of 120,000. So operating margin on the books, negative 20,000 euro. Cash-wise, you're out of 50,000 euro. So now let's switch to the second term that I started this video with, which is the runway. And the runway is very correlated to burn rate because runway is nothing else than the amount of cash you have in the bank divided by the burn rate. Again, in other terms, it says how many months you have to go before you run out of cash, assuming that you have a negative burn rate. But if we're talking about burn rate, we're talking about negative stuff. This is a very important measure. Again, it's intuitive why, and you should know it, and your investors will ask you what's your burn rate and what's your runway at that point in time. And later on, I'm also going to explain you how you should tailor your fundraise based also on the runway. But first, before that, let's take the example of before. So we said that we had a negative operating margin of 20,000 euro on a monthly basis, but a negative cash flow of 50,000 euro. So if you have $500,000 in the bank and you would use the book value, so the minus 20,000 euro, then you would end up with an operating a runway of 25 months. So 500 divided by 20. Truth is, the real runway that you have is 500,000 euro divided by 50,000 euro, which is the cash flow that you burned, which makes 10 months runway. So before we discuss how these two terms have an implication with the fundraising and with investors in general, uh, I want to answer the question, why would any company have a burn rate, right? Why are we even talking about burn rate? If you study business, you probably know that, when a business is for profit, the purpose of that is that the sum of the input that goes into the business is lower than the value of the output of that business, right? So intrinsically, you are not supposed to burn any cash, right? You're supposed to be for profit from day one. Truth is, startups are not a different type of business, but a different type. It's a different model of building a business. And the reason is quite simple. Startups are burning cash today. They have they're sacrificing what is a limited profit today for what is gonna be, according to their expectations, a much higher profit tomorrow. So this is why startups in the end of the day are raising capital, that is risk capital from investors. So in exchange for equity rather than debt from banks, because their purpose is to maximize their profit in 5 to 10 years time, not today. In other terms, what you can also say about startups is that the opportunity costs of making a profit today are higher than the profit that you can make today, right? Because you are actually, if you would make a profit, you're giving away an opportunity to make like a much bigger one. So again, it's about leap of faith and opportunity costs. When it comes to fundraising, burn rate is one of the first, well, probably second things that investors will ask you. So they're gonna ask you, okay, what's your burn rate? And what you should say is either the burn rate of the last month or what it has been the average of the past 2 to 3 months. I wouldn't say more historical than that, for the simple reason that startups are dynamic. So probably it was lower. They want to know in the very short term how much you can survive based on the situation of the company today. So just use that last month, last 2 months, something like that. And when you're raising capital, you should raise capital on average at least based on a runway of 18 months. And the runway is determined on the net burn rate. So for the sake of this video, we'll stop going to talk about gross burn rate because that doesn't apply in real life anymore. So investors are assuming that you raise capital with the purpose of burning it in 1.5 years time, right? Because they assume you're gonna be able to get to the next funding by then. If plan changes, it's profitability and burn is optional, so you can just slow down your growth and focus on your operations, right, on your margins. But for the sake of the scenario and for the sake of the investors investing in your company, taking that leap of faith, they want to see you burning that cash, which also implies that if you have a burn rate which is too low compared to the capital you want to raise, that is going to raise some questions in the terms of what are you going to do with that amount of capital. So let's say that you have a net burn rate of 10,000 euro per month and you're raising 1 million, then the investor will make the math that you are gonna burn the cash in approximately 100 months, and there's so they're gonna start wonder, okay, why is this guy even raising this much capital? Because is it gonna try to cash in on the fact that it's easy to raise capital? It just sounds like you are not really committed to the company, so it's gonna be too risky in the eyes of the investors, and they're not gonna give you the capital. In the past, this technique has been used by some companies, specifically some companies that were backed by bigger VCs, to burn as much as possible to raise a bigger amount of capital. That is something that worked in the past, especially for rocket internet companies, for instance. But in my experience, it's not the case anymore, as investors nowadays are more careful investing the capital. So just burning more capital, hoping or actually leveraging that to raise even more in the next round, is likely not to work anymore. Which brings us to the final topic of today's video, which is benchmarks. How do I know if I'm burning too much, too little, or just enough? Truth is, there is no benchmark available out there. You can ask your network, you can ask whoever you trust, but the thing is, you should decide for yourself, and there is no one size fits all. right? If you have the fortune to be angel or venture backed, then I would recommend you to ask your investors how, what are they confident and comfortable with you burning on a monthly basis. But at the end of the day, sometimes it's just, the leap of faith of the entrepreneur, even against his own angels or his or her own angels. As I said before, today's general trend is that there's a bigger constraint in terms of capitals for the early stage of companies, and especially there's a big jump or a big gap in between angel rounds or seed rounds and Series A rounds. VC firms used to be more open, to finance companies for larger amounts. Truth is that's not the case anymore, and they are looking at your unit economics. What are your unit economics? Well, that could be the topic for one of the next videos, but in short, they are your operating margins on a user case, on a customer case, lifetime value, all these kind of parameters that determine that regardless of the fact that you are burning today, if you would cut the expenditures and just leave the company go as it is, it would make a profit, right? It means that for every customer you bring in, the cost of acquiring that customer was lower than the value that customer brings in. And then maybe you'll be burning more because you want to keep on getting more and more customers for the sake of making a bigger profit tomorrow. But at least you know that your economics per customer are good. So I hope this helps you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.